hardest part in writing the book was separating myself from the research, right? Because each of one of these stories entailed a lot of research. I'm not a historian. It's not something that I already know just professionally, right? So I had to do a lot of research specifically to write each of these stories, and the research was so much fun that you could just spend months and months doing that and forget to write a story. And so I had to deliberately give myself a limit for the amount of research that I would do for each story. So the biggest obstacle in this particular story, which I was actually just talking about with Emma just before we came over here, was when you like a character too much, it's hard to make bad things happen to them. And that happened with a few of the characters here, and I saw that happen with Toussaint Louverture in the story of Napoleon Invades Louisiana. That happened again with Ben Franklin. I was able to overcome it in those cases, and that was also a challenge for this particular story. And I had in mind for Joan of Arc a negative model, and didn't want to do what Mark Twain did in his Joan of Arc, which is it's basically like hagiography, it's just like the lives of saints, and he wasn't able to reckon with her in the way that you need to as a writer. It's as a result, his favorite book, but I think his worst book. One of the greatest writers, in our history, but that book is terrible. So I was deliberately wanting to avoid that trap in writing this story. So it came kind of accidentally. The first story I wrote for the book was Columbus Discovers Asia, and that came out of the experience of reading Columbus's diaries and having a very particular picture in my head of who Columbus was, which was absent both from the kind of elementary school textbook version of things, obviously, but also absent from the kind of revisionist history, looking at him as this kind of this rapacious plunderer. He was that, but it was the product of his. The picture that emerged very vividly for me in reading his diaries was of a royal yes man, somebody who just wanted to please his royal masters at any cost. Not as like a bold conqueror or as like a particularly mean-spirited guy, just somebody who wanted to do his job really, really well, and his job was enslaving people and getting gold, right? And having that particular image of who Columbus was, which didn't, it seemed absent from the other reading that I had done, and also having this incongruous image of Columbus arriving on the shores of Shanghai, raising the royal standard and disembarking from Santa Maria and proceeding to do exactly what he did in the West Indies, which is to look around and say, how can I justify this trip? Once I had that image in my head, I could not write that. And it was only years later that I realized I had more to do and more to say in that realm. I was talking to an agent who had found that story in an Iowa Review, and was asking whether I had planned to write a whole book based on that story. And I said, well, gee, I'm not. But now that you mention it, I would like to write other stories. And so, I realized shortly thereafter that I had more stories like that in me, it had legs. And then the challenge that presented itself was trying to get away from the research because of how much research was required for each one of these stories. So, from inception to completion, it was probably about, 5 years, but, a good year and a half of that, after I wrote Columbus Discovers Asia, I wasn't actively working on it and thinking about it.
So you were working on other things?
Yeah, I tend to work on multiple projects simultaneously, so that if I stall on one thing, I have something else to throw that energy into. Or if I need to procrastinate for one, I'm always using that energy to work on something else. Yeah, no, that's something that I had to reckon with quite seriously very early on, and I think there are a lot of writers that that don't let morality figure into their writing process at all. I'm not one of those people. I can't shut that out. For me, I do have to give some serious thought to that, especially with a project like this one. And I thought that the only scenario in which I would have regrets of having written it is if the library's burned down and their only remaining book is this, and I'd be like, damn. But one of the best reactions that I've gotten, one of the most consistent reactions I've gotten from the book is somebody saying, damn it, Phong made me have to go and read the history, and that to me is a very positive result of reading this, is that it then impels them to learn more about the origins of these actual characters. And really, another obstacle of the research was finding that stories themselves are so compelling, they can't be improved upon. History is full of amazing stories, and historians that are very good at telling those stories as well. So I had to tell myself at a certain point, well, I'm not trying to improve on the stories, I'm telling a different story, and with a very specific purpose. I realized after several of these stories had been completed, which is not to muddy the waters of the way that we conceive of historical events, but to muddy the waters of the way that we conceive of historical figures, which is that we tend to appropriate them and we speak about them as though we know them personally, and we're all guilty of this. It's not just your, Tea Party patriot who's talking about the founders like they're a drunk uncle or something. It's, Ben Franklin's one of my favorite historical figures. I talk about him as though I know his mind and I have to catch myself. Oh, wait a second, he's somebody who had a completely different milieu than I did, a completely different background and history. And so we all do this. We appropriate historical figures because it's convenient, because we just feel like we care about them enough that they become family. But they did have a completely different set of core assumptions about the world. And one of the things that I found that I was doing eventually in working on this book is unsettling that certainty that we have about who these people are. And so I thought that was productive in a way that a historian would appreciate. At nearly every one of the readings that I've given for the book, there's been one historian, and one thing I do love to do is hear their alternate history ideas, and it's a game that I think some historians are very good at, some of them are not very good at, but I'm very deliberately also inviting in historians into the process of talking about it and challenging some of the things the book is doing. So, for example, I love to hear about the anachronisms, because there's inevitably going to be anachronisms in the book about history not written by a historian, right? At first I was worried about them. I was going through and saying, like, every book I would read subsequently after completing the story, I have to go back and really nervously, kind of attack it. I had a story that takes place in Egypt about Khufu, who commissioned the first Great Pyramid, and it refers to the Nile moving at a camel's pace. And then after the story was published in a journal, I read a book that said that camels weren't introduced to Egypt until 2,000 years after Khufu lived, and so I was able to change that one for the book. But at first, those things made me very, very nervous until I realized that for historians, that's part of the fun. Historians love to catch those anachronisms, and that's my favorite writers do that. So one of my favorite moments in Julius Caesar is when the clock chimes. I just imagine everybody turning around like, what's going on? And so we enjoy those anachronisms. That becomes part of the aesthetic experience, is being able to fact check a little bit. So far, the ones that I've caught and that people have caught have been very interesting. And as I say, that's knowledge you don't unlearn. When somebody catches you in a published book getting something wrong, even if it's fiction, And I'll always know that camels were introduced into Egypt in about 1000 BC and not 3000 BC. So yeah, it's in other words, one of the things that it required, and one of the things that's really been enjoyable about having published the book is that it becomes an ongoing conversation, as opposed to just having, the book is finished and I'm done with it. And now I get to have conversations with people who care about these historical figures, care about that tension between historical accuracy and imaginative work. And I find inevitably historians, are interested in both, So just because it's full of good stories. Yeah.
I have a really two-part question. One is, how did you decide which characters you were going to write about, what figures you were going to write about? And the second part is, were there any figures you wanted to write about, but the story wouldn't involve?
Oh yes, yeah, very, very much so. I'll answer that second part first, which is that there are many characters, historical figures that I researched that didn't make it in the book, more than did, in fact. And my criteria for determining what to use, because it's a textbook parody, right? They had to be kind of textbook figures, right? They had to be prominent historical figures, the kind of figures that you would learn about in like a survey history course. With the exception of someone like Khufu, who's connected to obviously a very famous monument. And they also had to have a plan A, because the concept of these stories is that these are the original intentions, the best laid plans of people whose plans were unfulfilled. And so some characters, that moment never happened, and for some it did. For others, it happened, but the story never came about for one reason or another. And I keep track of those, the outtakes, or the alternate history of the alternate history stories, on a Tumblr page, and that was my way of sort of putting out there in the world and saying, okay, I'm done with the book, even though I still, a lot more interesting things to explore, but then I'm passing the baton and hoping somebody else will do them, which I've seen some students especially, have been writing alternate history stories and sending me them. It's been kind of cool.
Do you have the URL for that?
Yeah, it's textbook of alternate history.tumblr.com. And so I'll give you some examples. One was the Great Wall of Utah, one of them, because Brigham Young had planned at one point to build a fortress with a wall that surrounded the entire Utah territory. It's larger than the state of Utah is today. It would have been so vast it would have rivaled the Great Wall of China. And he was prevented only by terrible sandstorms that year. And so he only got as far as building a small section of the foundation, and the wall was never constructed. So I had a great alternate history concept, but that never became a story because it's about an architectural project, right? It's about like the building a wall, and you can't really get your hands dirty with that, or I couldn't. And so I'm hoping somebody else will find whatever way into that story, but I never did. Another example would be the Billie Holiday's The Hungarian Suicide Song. If you don't know about that, that's her song Gloomy Sunday. There was a panic among not just the studio censors, and when she recorded the song, because it was based on a Hungarian song that was blamed for mass suicides in Hungary. And so they changed the song, they changed the lyrics to be more positive, they added a verse onto the song, which gave it kind of an uplifting feeling at the end. It's a devastating song if you listen to the song. And then if you hear the original Hungarian version and read the translation of the lyrics, it's even more devastating. But this is, of course, they changed the song. That one, for several reasons, I didn't write, but most important of which is that she didn't really fit the mold of the stories that I was telling, which is this consequential historical figure. She's a cultural figure, a consequential one, but I'd save that for another book, for like Da Vinci building a flying machine and other kind of cultural, important cultural moments. Another outtake is Saladin converts to Christianity, which is Saladin was the Muslim conqueror who had a really fascinating relationship with Richard the Lionheart, who was a Christian crusader. They cultivated a respect for each other as warriors, even as they were foes on the battlefield. And at one point, Saladin said that if he was going to send his men to fight and die in order to fend off the Christian crusaders, he owed it to his men to find out whether there's anything in this Christianity business. And so he went amongst the Christian encampment and, under the auspices of Richard the Lionheart, and said explicitly what his purpose was for being there, and saw such drunkenness and revelry and celebration that he was so shocked by that and returned with even firmer resolve to fight for Islam. And so in my alternate history version, I imagine that instead he experiences like a Rumi-like conversion into accessing the divine through bliss and through oblivion and through kind of getting rid of yourself. I guess I never wrote that one because I'm chicken shit and I didn't want to have a fatwa on me like Salman Rushdie. And I'm no Salman Rushdie, though I don't know if you read Joseph Anton, his book about being condemned to death by the Ayatollah Khomeini. Even Salman Rushdie is not Salman Rushdie in that sense. Anybody who has people they care about doesn't want to have a threat to their life. But tons of others. Definitely many more stories that didn't make it into the collection than did.